First of all, thank you so much for the invitation to this seminar series. I was delighted to learn that I have narrative friends out there that I wasn't aware of, actually. Being a narratively oriented scholar situated in a faculty of health sciences may be a quite lonely experience. So you learn to appreciate that there are, as a matter of fact, more of the kind out there. And also thank you for the wonderful introduction. It was far more elaborate than the one I had prepared for myself, so I'll simply skip mine. In my talk this afternoon, I'll reflect on playfulness in narrative care with Indigenous older adults. And for years, I've been working with the concept of narrative care. And thankfully, I've not done this in solitude. Rather, I've been thinking and writing about narrative care in close collaboration with my wise and wonderful Canadian colleagues, Vera Kane, Jean Clandinin, Charlotte Berendonk, and Pamela Steeves. And I would like to acknowledge that my talk this afternoon is pretty much based on the work we have done together. I would also like to acknowledge that parts of my talk today excuse me, are based on my relationship with my father, who passed away last month. And I would like to dedicate this talk to him. So if I get emotional, as I already have become during my talk, there's no reason to worry. Consider yourself warned. Well, it's already better. Other scholars have defined narrative care as a never-ending process of becoming better story listeners, and that story listening involves paying close attention to the stories people tell, to the way they tell them, and to the circumstances under which stories are told. Although I do agree that story listening is crucial, my understanding of narrative care is somewhat broader. First, I believe that narrative care goes beyond the telling and listening to stories. Stories live both in landscapes and in our bodies. Experiences are embodied, they reside in our bodies. Moreover, storytelling is in itself an embodied activity. Second, I'm concerned that the reduction of narrative care to a matter of being good story listeners may fixate our attention to the told, the content of the story, so to speak, and draw our attention away from the process of telling and the relational aspects of narration. Moreover, I'm concerned that the equation of narrative care with story listening rests on the assumption that telling is an indisputable human good. The sociologist Molly Andrews, for example, has written about the myth of healing. In the later years, I've become more and more intrigued with silences as an integral part of narration and narrative care, and I'll return to that later. In this talk, I build on Lugona's understanding of playfulness, particularly her call to remain attentive to a sense of uncertainty and an openness to surprise. Playfulness cultivates a generative sense of curiosity that relies on a close attentiveness, not only to the other, but to who we each are within relational spaces. Generative curiosity is only possible if we remain playful. In the continued, I will draw on my work alongside Indigenous older adults, as I'll show the possibilities of playfulness in the co-composition of stories across time. First, let me tell you about Inga. Inga was an Indigenous Sami woman in her 90s. Many years ago, I was privileged to come alongside Inga during my PhD work with Indigenous Sami older adults. Inga was born into a traditional reindeer herding family in a small Sami community. And at some point during our conversation, I asked Inga what her dreams for the future had been when she was a child. And she told me the following story. There was this old teacher. She came all the way from the south. She had no children of her own, and she wasn't married either. She wanted to bring a Sami child to the south to let the child go to school there, and she would pay for school for this child. If I went with her, I would have my own room and she would buy me clothes and everything. She promised, and I was so happy. I could go there and attend school. But then I went home and told my mother what the teacher said. She wants to take me there so I can learn. I can go to school there. There are lots of schools there. At first, my mother didn't say anything. Then she said, "You will learn to sew Sami clothes. That's enough school for you." She said that she would teach me to sew Sami clothes and that I would marry a Sami man, a reindeer herder. "No, I don't want to get married. Never," I said. I told the teacher, "You had to talk to my mother," but my mother said, no, Inga is not going anywhere. She will learn to sew Sami clothes and she will marry a Sami man with reindeer. And so it was. I was really angry with my mother. I cried and I cried, but it didn't help. The teacher took another girl from the orphanage. My mother said, "You can live from sewing Sami clothes. Not everybody can do that, but you can learn to do it." And so it was. After a moment of silence, I asked Inga, "When you look back at your life now, do you think that it turned out as you wished?" And she replied, "I do not regret marrying him. No, then things turned out well." Inga offered me this conclusion, not as a way to foreclose her story, but in a way that allowed me a way to engage and think with her experiences, to imagine the what-ifs in her story, and perhaps the what-ifs in my own stories. Older adults' narrations about roads not taken, such as the one Inga told me, open up questions about the stories we tell about our lives. Often the stories we tell and retell are chosen for a purpose and for an audience in specific interpersonal and discursive contexts. The meeting between Inga and myself was a meeting between two women who lived our lives under very different circumstances. We lived our lives in what could be considered two different worlds. Yet, through our narrative engagement, we collaboratively created a common world we could playfully explore. Inga invited me to travel to her childhood world and to the different worlds of opportunities that she was offered by her mother and by her teacher. In the aftermath, I have wondered if Inga also invited me to wonder with her about my own life as well. Inga told this story in ways that resonated across both our lives, despite different social, political, historical, and familial contexts. Inga's story filled a relational space between us with imaginative possibilities. Inga storied her life as one with no regrets, even though as a young child she was filled with the sadness about giving up the possibilities of attending school in the South. Through our active engagement, Inga and myself co-created a world that acknowledged the dreams Inga had so long ago, the life Inga could have lived, and the life she lived, and the person she became and is still in the process of becoming. Through this narrative engagement, both Inga's childhood dream and the life she lived were acknowledged as part of who Inga was and was becoming. At the heart of narrative care is the active, dynamic, and relational co-composition of stories from experience. As a response to the invitation to tell about who she was, Inga chose to tell a story both about who she could have become and who she became. In that sense, Inga's story was an invitation to me and to herself to engage in playful world traveling by connecting threads of experiences in new ways and trying out new ways of being. Our engagement included playful world traveling back and forth in time, traveling to worlds that happened long ago and worlds that lived only in imagination. My question, when you were a child, what were your dreams for the future, was an invitation both to look back from the perspective of an old woman, at a young girl growing up in a small Sami community at the beginning of the 20th century, and to look forward from the perspective of the girl at the life Inga had lived and was living. The young Inga was so present and alive in the story, in the way Inga voiced the young girl's anger and disappointment, as was the older Inga, with all her life experience and wisdom. Inga told a story about the attempt of an authority figure from the majority society to save an indigenous Sami child from her own community and her own culture. Within this context, Inga's narration is positioned among numerous stories of authorities removing indigenous children from their families and communities to make them into proper citizens. Such stories, some silenced for generations, yet others told but not paid attention to, have gained attention after the recent heartbreaking discoveries from Canadian residential schools. Inga's story was both a story about the potential abandonment of place and the community of home, and a story about the importance of home and community. Inga never abandoned her home, her family, and her community. She stayed, learned traditional Sami handicraft, and married a man deeply embedded in the traditional Sami reindeer herding culture. She never transformed into the others, that is, became a member of the Norwegian majority population. Thinking with Inga's story, I realized that I had mainly lived and is still living my life among the others, detached from traditional Sami communities and culture. I have in many ways become the other. In this perspective, Inga's invitation to travel with her back to the place she grew up was perhaps also a way for her to remind me of the importance of community, and also a loving invitation into community. In that sense, our narrative engagement illustrates the reciprocity of narrative care and its capacity to change all those involved. By traveling to the intersections between Inga's and my own stories, I gain new insights about my own life, my own choices, and my own experiences. I have wondered if the story Inga told also was a kind of resistance to the dominant narratives of the Sami, composed around plot lines of deficiency, inferiority, and being less than, less educated, less sophisticated, and less civilized. Perhaps was her story of her mother's refusal to let her go with the teacher an attempt at disrupting dominant narratives about the Sami in past and present, stories that always positioned her at the margins of the Norwegian society. In Inga's story, her mother said, Inga is not going anywhere. She will learn to sew Sami clothes and she will marry a Sami man with reindeer. Inga's mother draws on the domestic details, the particulars, that is, the particulars of the lives and relations that occurred in a particular location to frame a resistance narrative. Given the historical and social narratives that shaped the relations between Inga's mother and the teacher from the south, her mother's refusal to let Inga go was an act of resistance. But the mother also showed Inga a Sami plotline to compose a life that resisted the colonial attitude. Moreover, Inga made her mother's resistance her own by emphasizing it in her narration. Narrative care is never about finalizing stories and defining who are heroes and who are villains. Rather, in our engagement, both Inga's mother and the teacher were acknowledged as important for who Inga was and was becoming. There was, however, an undertone of vulnerability in Inga's story. Her story demonstrated the stronghold of the dominant narrative of the inferior Sami. Prior to the story about the teacher, Inga had told me that she tried to live as decently as possible all her life in order to prove wrong all those who think Sami people are inferior. The embodied experience of belonging to a stigmatized minority group was evident in the way Inga had been constantly conscious of her conduct and thereby took responsibility for how all Sami were perceived by the majority. Thinking with this story now, many years later, I wonder if Inga may have felt that she had to prove, even to me, that the Sami are as good as other people, which were the exact words she used. In our contemporary Western society, education is considered a virtue. Inga did not tell her story as a story about lost opportunities for education, although that may have been the way she saw it as a child. In her telling of the story, Inga came to appreciate that there was another knowledge and education, a familial cultural curriculum being offered in her home place. In her story, Inga resisted dominant ideas of knowledge and education and came to see that, as her mother had suggested so long ago, that there was another knowledge at work. Inga told her story as having lived with an alternative view of knowledge. Perhaps was she telling me, the PhD student from the university, that there are forms of knowledge and skills you cannot learn in schools. That such knowledge and skills are transmitted and transformed in close interpersonal relationships, and that learning this type of knowledge and skills is a privilege. Once again, I'm reminded of the reciprocity of narrative care and its capacity to alter relations. I have undoubtedly had opportunities in my life that Inga, who grew up in a different time, place, and socio-historical context, never had. However, Inga also had opportunities that I, who have lived my life in the Norwegian majority society, have never had. So, what does all this have to do with playfulness? For me, narrative care is a way of making sense of the world together. Core to narrative care is the necessity of engaging with world traveling with imagination, improvisation, and playfulness. Narrative care is the acknowledgement of the here and now moment, that is, a shared world co-composed and playfully explored by those involved in narrative care. Moreover, narrative care is the acknowledgement that we all have pasts and we all have futures. Our embodied stories of the pasts and our hopes for the future shape our possibilities for playful world traveling into each other's worlds. Narrative care allows us to move past fixed stories and experiences. By engaging in narrative care, we hold all stories open to inquiry and possible retellings and relivings. Not because we want to forefront pain or regret or a sense of loss, but because we can gain new insights and understand each other in new ways. We look both backwards and forwards to continue to learn. Narrative care is about this opening to learning, to surprise, to ways in which we can retell and relive our lives in ways that allow us to become otherwise. Earlier, I promised to say a few words about my interest in silence. Paradoxical as it may seem, I consider silence as an integral part of narrative and narrative care. I believe our told and untold stories are shaped by silences, and our stories in turn shape silences. As I indicated earlier, I do not necessarily consider the point of narrative care to be the breaking of silences. But I do believe we must acknowledge that there are different kinds of silence. First, silence may be a quietness or stillness that allows us to turn inward. In this sense, silence may be understood as a practice. But there are other forms of silence. Jean Clendenin has noted that we live in nested stories. We live in the midst of familial intergenerational stories, cultural, temporal stories, institutional stories, and personal stories. Within each of these nested stories, we see the resonances of silences. Let me illustrate this by telling you one of my own stories. My paternal grandparents were born in the transition from the 1800s to the 1900s. They were both born into Indigenous Sami families living in rural villages on the coast of northern Norway. They were also born into one of the darkest chapters of Norwegian history, characterized by assimilation policies towards the Sami. According to public opinion, the Sami were primitive people, and the best course of action was to make them Norwegian. The school system was a central instrument in the assimilation policies. In addition to the public policies, the Sami experienced stigmatization, discrimination, and everyday racism. My grandmother entered school in 1914. On one of my grandmother's first days in school, the teacher asked if one of the children could lead the rest of the class in Our Lord's Prayer. My grandmother eagerly raised her hand, knowing she had learned the prayer at home and knew it by heart. When the teacher pointed at her, she stood up by her desk and proudly started to recite the prayer in her mother tongue. After a sentence or two, she was interrupted by her teacher, asking her to stop and go to the shame corner of the classroom. She could not quite understand what she had done wrong until the teacher stated, "God does not know the Sami language." Let me pause my story here. The silencing of my grandmother was literal, immediate, and explicit. The little girl was denied of speaking to her God in her own language, and accordingly, she never did so again. I know very little about how this experience shaped her relationship with God, with her teacher, and with the other students. And I know little about how this experience shaped how she saw herself, her family, and her cultural and linguistic background. I do know, however, that this experience has shaped my own life story. Let me continue. My grandmother gave birth to 12 children. Most of them died at a young age due to tuberculosis and poverty. However, my father survived as one of 5 siblings. Most likely driven by the best of intentions and their own experiences, my grandparents never spoke with their children in the Sami language. Let's pause my story again. Etta Lewis wrote, "Silence is not always the absence of voice, but rather a muting of voice," end quote. Oppression mutes voices, and these are the silences following silencing. For my grandparents, not speaking to their children in the Sami language was an intentional silencing, brought on by the profound shame around the Sami language. Yet it was more than a language. From a very young age, my father and his siblings learned to conceal their Sami family history, and they were all quite successful at becoming Norwegians. Not once during my childhood did my father talk to me about his Sami family history. My grandparents wished for their children to pass as Norwegians. Those of their children who survived their own childhoods experienced that passing rather than resistance was the safest route to managing in the Norwegian society. They learned to story themselves by silencing parts of who they were. That was what my grandmother had learned in her grade 1 classroom. Silence your language, your familial and cultural background, and do not resist. And the silencing of the little girl's prayer created ripples into future generations. The only recollection of the Sami I have from my own childhood is the representations of the Sami as an exotic reindeer herding people in my school books, none of which resembled my own family. All stories are told in the midst of other and other stories, and in the midst of silences. Our personal stories are made possible or impossible by the stories and the silences surrounding us. The stories about the Sami I was introduced to in my school books deprived me rather than provided me with a space to story myself and my family. Barrett once wrote, "There is something epistemological about storytelling. It's the way we know each other, the way we know ourselves, the way we know the world. It's also the way we don't know, the way the world is kept from us, the way we're kept from knowledge about ourselves, the way we're kept from understanding other people." End quote. As a child, I could not recognize myself and my family in the way the Sami were presented in the Norwegian school system. Knowledge about myself and my family was kept from me by the stories I learned about the Sami. Let me return to my story. I remember the first time I asked my father about our family history. It was in the early 80s, during the so-called Alta affair. The Norwegian government had decided to dam the Alta Kautokeino River, causing the flooding of reindeer herding grazing areas and Sami villages. This caused massive protests from both the Sami movement and the environmental movement. I vividly remember images on television of the hunger-striking Sami outside the Parliament building in Oslo. I was only 8 years old, but I wanted to be one of them. I remember asking my father about our family history, desperately wanting him to confirm that I was one of them. However, not only did he refuse to confirm that I was, he refused to talk about it at all. And I learned that this was not a topic of conversation in our family. As humans, we're continuously trying to make sense of our existence, and it is through story we make meaning. This process of meaning making is a relational endeavor. We need someone to co-compose meaningful stories with, and we need someone else's stories to confirm our own. In that sense, other silence can impose silence on us. Still, sometimes we continue in our attempts. In the early 90s, I entered university as a student of social sciences. Throughout my years of studies in psychology and social anthropology, I gradually acquired a language to position my family's history in the broader stories of assimilation and discrimination. However, this language was not a language through which I could talk with my father about our history. I remember confronting him, trying to force him to admit that we were Sami. I remember triumphantly asking him, how come we're not Sami when both your parents' mother tongue was Sami? And I remember his hasty and evasive answer, well, everybody spoke Sami back then, doesn't mean they were Sami. Back then, I did not understand that my father's silence could have been an act of care. I did not understand that perhaps his silence was an attempt to protect himself, his mother, and myself from the shame his mother had experienced as a child. After 4 years and a degree in social sciences, I decided to enter nursing school. Throughout the years in nursing schools, I don't think I ever raised the issue of our family history with my father again. However, I did meet Sami patients, and I met patients who shared stories with me. Maybe it was during those years I stopped confronting my father with the stories I believed he was obliged to tell me. Maybe it was during those years I learned to accept his silences and rather started to listen to the stories he chose to share with me. In one way of understanding silence, we can understand it as the other side of telling. In order to let the other person's story to unfold, we need to remain silent, listen carefully, and resist the temptation to fill the gaps with our own interpretations and explanations. By telling you my story, I've tried to make visible different aspects of silence. Silence is a form of narration. It's a way to express experience, and it is an experience in and of itself. I also understand silence as a relational phenomenon, as co-composed, so to speak. Silence may also be understood as the context for stories, like in Newman's metaphor of the blank page that let the blackness of the print emerge. Silences may be loving and accepting, but they may also be painful and agonizing. Narrative care is not necessarily about breaking silences. It may also be about honoring silences and practicing silence. We need to think carefully about which silences to break, which silences to protect, and how we practice silence. I believe a first step in such a direction is to be wakeful to the silences in and between people's stories, to the silences in our own lives, and to the functions silences may have in both our own and others' lives. Thank you for listening.